Okay, thank you everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Manny Figueredo and I'm privileged to be the Director of Education for Hamilton Wentworth District School Board. Thank you for attending our information session. We all count around our first Student Census 2021. And I'll ask Rob, who's supporting us, if he could change slides, please. So what you see in front of you is the content and the agenda this evening. We'll have an opening and a land acknowledgement. We'll talk about our census. We'll talk about the consultation findings of our census. We'll also be highlighting the human rights and collecting identity-based data. We'll also be speaking about data integrity, privacy and confidentiality, next steps, and an opportunity for questions and answers. Next slide. Bob, if you can go to next slide, mine hasn't changed. Thank you. Thank you. We always like to begin with our land acknowledgement, one of our commitments from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's important that we as Hamilton Wentworth District School Board that we acknowledge our presence on ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land. And we're reminded of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This treaty, Wampum Belt, represents the treaty relationship between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Anishinaabe with respect to sharing the land and resources therein. And the intent of this agreement is for all nations sharing the territory to do so responsibly, respectfully, and sustainably in perpetuity. We also respect the long-standing relationships with the local Indigenous communities, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'll do a quick introduction of the people who will be presenting this evening. You'll eventually see different people appearing on the screen. Again, I'm Manny Figueredo, the Director of Education. You'll also meet our Principal of Equity, Michelle Ronnie Bartolos. In addition, a community engagement consultant who supported this work, Dr. Siobhan Niles, will be with us this evening. Thank you. Also, our Human Rights and Equity Officer, Johanna Otete. Our Research Manager and Analytics, Sally Langdon. And we're also being supported this evening by Rob Faulkner, our Communications Manager, and Nathan, who is supporting us technically behind the scenes. So thank you. I won't list or read all the names that you see in front of you, but I want to acknowledge the entire working group who's been committed to this critical work. And I want to thank everyone who's been committed to moving this work forward from our Equity Action Plan. I really want to speak about the why. You can see there that our work is connected, yes, to the Anti-Racism Act, and all school boards are expected organizations to have a student census completed by 2023. The province also, yes, has an Ontario Equity Action Plan, and our Equity Action Plan in HWDSB reflects this. But I really want to speak to the core of why this is critical, because I have received, or we have received at times, some resistance to why this is important. Why is it critical to unpack and have people identify who they are and their specific identity? So I want to speak to that. We've had over the years and decades, our racialized, marginalized, Indigenous communities, our community of Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ provide us a lot of data in a form of storytelling, the qualitative data, and they at times very frustrated with institutions like school boards, because they've been telling us that they have their experience is not the experience that we often celebrate. So when we speak about successes of our graduation rate increasing to 82%, they'll say, but that's not been our experience. Or when we speak about more students reading and achieving targets, they'll say, but that's not been the experience of my child. So at times we have to, as an organization, demonstrate through quantitative data collection that there are patterns that are emerging, and those patterns that are emerging, they emerge because of institutions. And so we've been pushed and encouraged by many to say, you need to collect this data, and it's just going to tell you exactly what we've been telling you for decades. So the qualitative stories are critical, but to quantify this is also critical as well. So we can start unpacking what are the systemic barriers that we as institutions are actually putting in place or not removing in order for more students to achieve, or all students to achieve. So this is critical. And we know it's voluntary, and we want to promote it throughout our district. And many school boards have already done this work. Other school boards are yet to do this work, but this isn't aligned with what we did a few years ago regarding our staff census. So how do students see themselves represented? How do they see themselves represented in the curriculum, the teaching and learning that happens every day, or how do they not see themselves reflected there? And how does that become a barrier? How do the students see themselves reflected in the educators in front of them every day? Or how do they not see themselves reflected, and that becomes the barrier? And how do they see themselves reflected or not with the leaders of the schools and leaders of the organization? So both of these are critical if we are serious about addressing student achievement and well-being for all in public education, because education is a critical social deterrent. And if we're serious about it, we have to unpack and see the patterns that are emerging and do something about it. And it's a moral imperative for us to do so. So on that note, I will ask the team to go to the next slide, which is a little video we'd like to show you. And then Michelle will be taking over from me. Thank you. In Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, we are committed to equity, engagement, learning, and innovation. We want all our students to achieve their full potential. And to do this, we need to critically look at all our schools and all our service departments at any barriers that could be getting in the way. We have to be prepared to address the gaps in student achievement and well-being, gaps that occur because of factors that discriminate against our students, such as ancestry, sexual orientation, abilities, socioeconomic factors, just to name a few. Therefore, This spring, we are launching We All Count, our first student census data survey. This is critical. We want our students to tell us more about themselves so we can be more responsive, identify barriers, remove them, so we can ensure our students are being as successful as possible in Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board.
We All Count, HWDSB Student Census 2021 is a voluntary and confidential student survey that collects identity-based data to identify and address systemic barriers. The Student Census was one of the priority projects that was outlined in the HWDSB Equity Action Plan. The data collected in this survey will help the board to understand who HWDSB students are. The goal is to help in identifying and then addressing systemic barriers. The data collected will help the board to make evidence-informed decisions that can lead to more equitable outcomes.
Many school boards have already conducted a student census. This year, the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board is going to conduct our very first student census. The Anti-Racism Act and Ontario Education Equity Action Plan require school boards to collect and report on student identity-based data by the year 2023. In addition, the Ontario Human Rights Commission recognizes that this data is essential in identifying barriers and creating equitable outcomes for students.
There are 9 questions on the census. These ask about a student's languages, Indigenous identity, ethnicity, race, religion. These questions are consistent with the Ontario Anti-Racism Act and were developed in consultation with students, families, staff, and community. You can see the survey on our website at hwdsb.on.ca/weallcount.
In April, the board will send a secure link to all students in grade 5 to grade 12 so that they can complete the census online in class with the support of their classroom teacher. For students in kindergarten to grade 4 who are learning virtually, your parents will receive a link to the survey that you can complete with them online. If your parents prefer a paper copy, they can contact their home school and get one mailed to them.
We will use the data to understand the makeup of the HWDSB student population and to produce reports on student well-being, achievement, and participation in programming. By identifying trends and gaps, HWDSB will be able to see which groups are over or underrepresented in certain areas. HWDSB will use this trend analysis to improve school environments, eliminate discriminatory practices, and remove barriers to student success. HWDSB will publicly report census results and how it has helped guide HWDSB programs, strategies, policies, practices, resources, and supports.
HWDSB is committed to the highest levels of research ethics, privacy, and confidentiality when collecting information from students and families. Student census data collection follows Government of Canada research ethics practices and policies and is done in compliance with the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The student census is confidential, but it is not anonymous. Student information will be grouped together for analysis so that no student can ever be identified. We will store student census information in a secure, confidential database that will only be accessed by HWDSB research staff. We will look at census data alongside other student data so that we can begin to see patterns and identify barriers to different groups of students.
Completing the census is voluntary. However, HWDSB asks all students to participate in order to receive an accurate picture on the student population. A high response rate will better help the HWDSB identify barriers, create strategies, and make informed decisions addressing these barriers to student achievement and well-being. Families who do not want their child to participate can opt out on the parent portal.
After the census is conducted in April 2021, research and analytics staff will evaluate the results and report back publicly in November 2021. HWDSB will inform students and families of the decisions that flow from the data collected in the student census.
Everyone working on the student census would love to hear your questions. For more information, you can access resources and frequently asked questions at hwdsb.on.ca/weallcount. You can also reach the Student Census team by submitting an email to census@hwdsb.on.ca or complete an anonymous form through the Census website.
Thank you, Bob. So to the next slide, please. And I'll just introduce myself. I am Michelle Rodney Bartolis, and I am one of our system principals in HWDSB with the portfolio of equity. So people may be asking, what exactly is the student census? As was said in the video, the student census is a voluntary collection of student identity-based data. That data could include information about languages, Indigenous identity, ethnicity, race, religion, or spiritual affiliation, gender identity, sexual orientation, abilities or disabilities, place of birth or citizenship. For students in kindergarten to grade 4, there are 8 questions and 9 questions for those in grades 5 to 12. All the questions are multiple choice, and you can view the questions on our board website at hwdsb.on.ca/weallcount. Next slide, please. So people might be asking, what is the purpose of the survey? And what type of information, what are we going to do with the information that we collect from the student census? We're going to use the information to gain a clearer understanding of who our HWDSB students are. We'll also use the information to better understand the needs of students by breaking down student data into smaller groups based on characteristics such as race or gender or ability, to name a few. We will use the data to identify and monitor systemic inequities in programs, outcomes in student achievement and well-being by linking this identity-based data with data about educational outcomes, program participation, and resource allocation, to name a few areas. And finally, the data will be used to inform local decision-making in a way that meets identified student needs, to improve service delivery and reduce the disproportionality and disparities that are currently existing in our system. Participation in the census is voluntary. Go to the next slide. But the more students who participate, the more accurate the data will be. So we would encourage all students to participate. Each question has an option to choose prefer not to answer. So even if you start the survey, you can choose to answer 1 to all 9 of the questions that are asked. Students or parents who do not want to participate can simply avoid completing the survey altogether. Parents and guardians can also fill out the opt-out form that's available in the parent portal or email census@hwdsb.on.ca to opt out. Next slide, please. So for people who ask, how exactly will the survey be done? It is a form. And for kindergarten to grade 4 students, the form is actually filled out by caregivers on behalf of their children. You will receive an email that contains a unique link of the online survey. Paper surveys are available by request through your home school. For students in grades 5 to 12, the survey is filled out directly by the student. Each student will receive an email with a unique link to the online survey. There will be dedicated classroom time that will be provided so that the students can be supported by classroom educators in completing the survey. Special education students would be provided with individualized support as needed. The census is available in other languages other than English. The survey and related information materials have been translated into the top 10 languages at HWDSB from the information that we currently have now. So if you complete the survey, we might have different information. Those languages right now are Arabic, Chinese, Farsi, French, Karen, Korean, Somali, Spanish, Urdu, and Vietnamese. Interpretation services will be provided for other languages that are not listed on an individual basis as required. Just contact your homeschool principal. I'm going to pass it on now to Dr. Siobhan Niles to go through the community engagement piece.
Thank you, Michelle. I was unmuted. So hi, everyone. I am an independent consultant that had the opportunity to work with the board on the student census. So we did community consultations in January and February of this year, where students, community advisories, and parents and other community members and partners participated. Folks identified as being racialized, Black, Indigenous, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+ students, and so we had and students with disabilities. We had a diverse group of students, community members, parents, and caregivers that came out, as well as the committees that work with the Hamilton board. I thought that information would be helpful as I go through the different themes, or the main themes that came out of the community consultations. Next slide, please. So here are the main thoughts and themes that came out of the consultation. Number one was around data integrity and data storage. Many participants in the consultations spoke about needing more information in accessible language about how the data from the student census would be stored and how would the board ensure data integrity, especially because of the ways in which data has been used against historically marginalized individuals to dehumanize these folks. So folks felt it was important to have this information in plain language. It was mentioned that the board is using the Anti-Racism Data Standards Act to guide the way in which this data would be collected and stored, and as well as who would have access to the information. But participants felt that having this information and being reminded of the process and the board making that as clear as possible would be helpful. The second question, and a very important question or theme that came up, was around accessibility. Participants mentioned the importance of, when thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about folks who have language barriers, students who are nonverbal, folks that have different literacy skills and the different ways in which they would be supported, including newcomer students, thinking about English language learners, and students with different types of disabilities. They also wanted us to think about how information can get lost in translation, and so what will the board do to support students before, during, and after? The third important point that came up was reminding us that identity is never neutral, and these questions can elicit different emotions for different students. And so participants wanted to ensure that the board is recognizing the harm that can be caused by asking these questions and thinking again about the supports that will be put in place for different students. Some of the suggestions that were made were to have counselors, social workers in school linked to external resources. Many participants mentioned the importance of rebuilding trust. Many felt that trust has been broken in many ways, and it's important that the board is very honest in acknowledging that and working with community members, working with the student body to rebuild that trust. So transparency was very important to participants. And I'll end with this because this was a common theme in all the consultations with all the student groups, was a sense of hope. While they acknowledged the harm that can be caused by collecting this information, students were hopeful, the students that came out to the session, that the information that they share, their stories and their truth, will be used in a way in which to make the board better, and that so that we can begin to better understand the barriers, the challenges, the trends, and be actionable and start to implement changes. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Johanna. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. So I am Johanna Otite. I am the Human Rights and Equity Officer at HWDSB. We get the question that does HWDSB have the right to collect such personal information? So we know that many people think that collecting identity-based data is not allowed, but actually, like collecting data. I think I was disconnected, so I will start again. So many people ask that if collecting identity-based data like the student census is allowed. So yes, school boards can collect personal information, including identity-based data or human rights-based data, as long as they have a purpose, and the goal is to identify and remove barriers for student achievement and well-being. And this is as per the Education Act and then also the Ontario Human Rights Code. As it is mentioned earlier, all school boards are now required to collect race-based data as legislated by the Anti-Racism Act, which was legislated in 2017. Next slide. We also have the Ontario Human Rights Commission also allows and actually have documents that guides organizations like HWDSB. Next slide, please. So the Ontario has what they call the anti-racism data standard. So the Anti-Racism Directorate established tools to embed race-based data collection within government and public sector. So HWDSB is included in that. So the data standard for the identification and monitoring of systemic racism and the regulation under the Anti-Racism Act is where HWDSB is using the legislation to be in compliance with, even though that we are doing it not only to be compliant, but it's because it is important for the equity work that we need to do. Next slide. So the data standard sets out standardized requirements and guidance to help organizations like HWDSB to meet the standard and how to ask the questions when you conduct identity-based data. It also sets out privacy protection requirements to prevent the misuse of data collected. It also defines the purpose, so which is it has to be done to identify and monitor inequalities in public sector policies, programs, and services. It also requires open data and reporting to make sure that there is public transparency and accountability. Next slide. And now we'll pass it to Sally.
Thanks, Johanna. I'm Sally Landon, the manager of the Research and Analytics Department, and I'll talk to you a little bit about privacy and confidentiality and the research aspect of this project. So as you heard in the introductory video, we are committed to the highest levels of privacy and confidentiality when collecting personal information from parents and families. When organizations collect personal information, they must be legally authorized to do so, and they must comply with privacy legislation. In the case of the census, the Anti-Racism Act and the Education Act give us that legal authority to collect the information, and our process is in compliance with the Privacy Act. Next slide, please. The data collected online is stored in secure Canadian data centers that have industry standard accreditation for data security. The data is encrypted in transit and at rest. Once the census is complete, we will download that data from those online servers and we'll delete it from the online storage and keep it in a secure database on an encrypted device in the Research and Analytics Department, where only our data scientist has access to it. So she will link the census data to other student data and then remove the student identifier before our research officer and our research analyst can use that data for analysis. None of the census data that we collect will leave the Research and Analytics Department. Only summary reports and aggregate data tables will be shared outside of the department. This is how we ensure that the data is never able to be used to identify a student. Next slide, please. So how will the data be used? The data will be used to produce a series of summary reports and tables containing aggregate data on student achievement and well-being. So for example, graduation rate, suspension and expulsion, school climate. These will in turn help to inform and positively influence decision-making for addressing gaps at the board and school levels. The data is one tool to keep the school board accountable for consistently identifying and addressing inequities. Next slide, please. Everything we do regarding data collection and handling is guided by the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans. This is a Canadian standard that was collaboratively produced by Canada's 3 federal research agencies. We also inform our work using decolonizing methodologies and principles of self-determination and the right of individuals to control their own personal information. We understand that cultural humility and safety are foundational to meaningful and respectful engagement. We understand that a distinctions-based approach acknowledges the distinct histories, interests, and priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We understand that Indigenous-driven processes and partnerships are fundamental to the appropriate use of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis data. We understand that data and information about identity are critical tools for self-determination. And we understand that the inherent and collective sovereign rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to self-determination include ownership and governance of their data, irrespective of where it is housed, and control over their own lives. Next slide, please. So why doesn't the census ask about students' experience in school? Our goal through the census is solely to collect socio-demographic information. At other times of the year, we conduct surveys that, for example, ask about students' experiences for the purpose of supporting positive culture and well-being. The Middle Years Development Instrument, or MDI, for example, for grades 4 to 12 will be administered this May following the student census. This survey asks questions about caring adults in schools, students' feelings of belonging and well-being at school, and it's the census that will now give us the capability of understanding the MDI in more depth, because now we will be able to identify well-being and sense of belonging trends based on demographic factors that we collect in the census. This is how the census will help us to really understand where barriers are preventing students from reaching their full potential. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Johanna.
Currently what we are doing is making sure that students, parents, and communities have information about the student census so that they can make informed decision. So this is the first information session that we are conducting. And we have another one tomorrow targeting students. And then for parents who may miss today or community members missing today, we also have another one Saturday. And then next Wednesday, we have another one for students. And then we also want to talk to our community partners about the student census so that everyone is informed on what the board is doing. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of information that's available about the student census. So the first one is, as it is mentioned earlier, on the web page. So hwdsb.on.ca/weallcount. We have a lot of information there about the student census. There is a video introduction that you just watched earlier. And we have provided a glossary of terms explaining some of the terms that are used in the census. We also have a document for frequently asked questions. So we answer questions as they come in and update that document. We also have a document that explains why we are asking each question. Why are you asking about race? Why are you asking about gender identity, and so on. Where we are also working on an explanatory video, actually explaining for students, especially how to complete the survey, and this will come soon. We also have the documents and then the survey itself translated into 10 languages. And then we have interpretation services for English learning students and then also families as well. So if they, especially for the language that are not translated, but students can request for an interpreter to come, and then they can help them to translate the survey and help them. We are working with settlement workers in schools to ensure that also our newcomer students and families have access to all the information that they need. Next slide. I think this is a repeat, so I'll pass this one. So next steps. So currently we are conducting these information sessions. And the next step is so we will be launching the student census on May 3rd. So that's when the emails will be sent out with the unique link for each student, and then for the younger grades for parents or guardians. And there will be a report in the fall with the preliminary result, what we have heard from the census, and then that will not be the end of it. Like, so based on what we are seeing, connecting the data with other data sets, we will be producing a series of reports. And then down the line, we want again to engage students, families, and communities on the gaps that are going to be identified. How are we going to address them? To address that, that will be also part of the plan in terms of like what is going to be happening. Okay, you collected this data, you identified the gaps, then what? So with that, in that process, we are going to include students, families, and community to help us do the next step, like take that the next step of doing the work. Next slide. So that's what we have for today. So next we have the question and answer. So we will, you can type your questions in the question and answer area. So do we see any questions that is coming in?
Yeah, there's a question about opting out for a grade 5 to 12 student. What will happen to them during the dedicated class time?
Okay, so anybody can jump in for answering, but I will try to answer that. So what will happen at that time would be the students who are opting out, they don't have to do that. So especially now that we are in remote learning, they will engage in their independent work while the other students are completing their census.
And there's a question about timing. When is the survey being sent out to grade 4 to 12s, or has it already been sent?
No, it hasn't been sent yet. It will be sent on May 3rd. So starting May 3rd. So Salik, do you want to answer that question? So
sure.
You think all families will be getting that the email on May 3rd, or is it coming by parts?
We'll start sending them out on May 3rd, and we might end up having to send them out in bundles depending on our email limits. So May 3rd we will launch, and we'll send out the maximum number of emails that we can send that day, and it's possible that we'll have to do a bunch of them every day that week.
Okay, I see
Well,
one
that's
more.
it for the questions, Johanna. Yeah.
Okay, do you want to read it? Please read it. Okay, I can't see it.
Sorry, there is one, yeah. I wonder if you could please explain how you consulted with disabled students, since there was not an official consultation session for them.
So we have some targeted consultation session with students, and then also we have consulted the advisory committees, where SEAC, which is a special education advisory committee, was one of them. Even though we didn't have a dedicated session with for students with disabilities or special education, there were students that participated in the other sessions that have brought that perspective. But it's a good point. In the future, when we do community consultations, we have learned that, and then we should have dedicated session for students with special education or students that have experience with disabilities. Thank you for that question.
There's a question, Johanna. How is school climate data triangulated with the individual student identifier?
I think I will pass that question to Sally.
We're only using the student identifier to link those data sets. So when we have the census data, that's the demographic information, we can link that to achievement data or to well-being data using that identifier, that student identifier, as the primary key. Once those data sets are linked, we get rid of that. We remove that completely from the data set, so there's no identifiers in the data set. So the triangulation is looking at demographic factors against achievement factors, against well-being factors. That's how we triangulate.
There's a question. Why was the decision made to include sexual orientation in grades 5 to 7 when the Ontario curriculum states grade 8 for these definitions to be covered?
I think maybe I will pass this question to the educators in the room, maybe Michelle, but it is sexual orientation is introduced in the curriculum starting from grade 5. Michelle, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the expanded definitions of sexual orientation and getting into gender identity and a number of other things occur in later grades, but in grade 5 is when I think it starts to be introduced. So there is one question that occurs, I believe, in a variety of different surveys, just asking students about their sexual orientation, and of course, students with every question can prefer not to answer. And if they don't understand the question, their teachers are there to support, and really if the student doesn't understand, the teacher will probably just let them say prefer not to answer.
Those are all the questions that are published so far. If anyone has any more, please add them to the chat. That seems to be it for questions right now. There is one more. Another question about well-being data. Have you then saved data from previous surveys with regard to well-being in order to link it to this survey?
I can try to answer that question. We didn't specifically save data from previous surveys to link to the census. We typically don't collect identifiers when we're surveying students. The MDI is different. We do collect identifiers for the MDI. So we have an MDI from 3 years ago, I think. We may or may not be using that to connect to the student census because we're administering MDI again in May. So that would be our most current data. We would look at the MDI over time. I mean, the first MDI is our baseline, so this one is our first time that we get to compare to the baseline. We haven't made a decision yet about whether we would link the census data to the previous MDI or whether we would just move forward with the current data and what we collect in the future.
Okay, there's another question. Doesn't HWDSB think that seeing people as part of a group rather than as individuals leads to more racism and discrimination, not less?
I think I can answer that. Racism is a fact. So we acknowledge that it exists in our society, and also it exists in our education system. So by talking about it, or by centering identities and knowing our students, that's how we can start these conversations. But by avoiding the conversation, racism will not go away. So that's the approach that we are taking. We need to talk about identities, and our students' identity needs to be centered not only at the system level, but in the classroom, in the material that they learn, in the curriculum, and everywhere. And talking about that doesn't create racism, but avoiding to talk about it is what is actually what it perpetuates and invalidates the experiences of marginalized and racialized students.
There's a question about research. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add one other piece about leading to more racism and discrimination. I think that part of addressing racism and discrimination is addressing the systemic issues that we have. And right now, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. There about what our student population is like, but not other indicators. And so I think that part of what this census will do, and I'm speaking about this from the point of view of having worked in another board that had been collecting that data for about the last 20 years. The ability that it gives boards is to actually create and target resources to certain groups, because you are able to actually identify the systemic pieces a lot easier. And so it doesn't actually, I think, lead to more racism and discrimination. It leads to less, or the ability to address it.
Thank you, Michelle. There's a question about research. What research are you using that supports this approach? This questioner says they don't see any.
I'm not sorry to the questioner. I don't know which approach you're describing. if you're talking about the census in general and why we're doing it and why we're linking it to other data to look for these patterns and barriers, the research tells us that systemic racism and systemic inequities affect students' learning trajectories. The research tells us that there are, real barriers that cause students to not graduate, barriers that influence students' feelings of safety at school, influence student bullying, which affects student learning trajectory. So the research that we're looking at strongly supports the approach that we're taking with the student census and what we'll be doing with that data.
There is a question about the options for parents and children who choose to opt out of the survey. What are the options for them? I'm not sure if the question is about what will they do in the time or what other ways that they can communicate with the board.
So I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but if it is opt out, first of all, like you can simply ignore and do not complete the survey. So like there is no, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. So you don't even need to opt out. But to ensure that your kids, once they are in class, they don't participate, you can send us. So the opt-out form is available in the parent portal. And then also you can simply send an email to census@hwdsb.on.ca. And then we will take out your child's name so we don't generate the link for the survey for them, so they don't receive it. So is that what the question is about? What are the options? But is it an option to participate in similar opportunities? But if it is the option about opt-out, so email. So your email should include your child's name, their school and grade, so that we can take them out from the list so they don't get the email.
I would also like to mention that we do honor everybody's right to change their consent after the fact, and as long as we have identifiers connected to the census data, the original data set, you can send us an email after the census has been filled out and we can remove the data belonging to your child.
There's a question about suspension expulsion data. In regards to suspensions and expulsion data, will it include the data of Black students previously stated by Ministry of Education to be omitted from records from grades JK to 3?
So this is a bit different from the student census, but this is something we are discussing at the school board, but maybe I will have Manny speak to that.
So can you hear? I'm just doing a sound check. You can hear me? So thank you for the question. We are absolutely going to be looking at that recommendation around the concerns. Two things is to your question around students in K to 3 who might have a suspension record, to expunge that from their record so it doesn't stay in their record. Yes, and we're going to be bringing some recommendation to the Board of Trustees to consider that. It is within our purview to do so. And I just wanted to comment on another one, if earlier question around why focus on differences versus focus on humanity and similarities. I just wanted to comment as a person, a white person in a very privileged position, and every time I look at our data and think about 80 to 80% of our students are graduating, that's about 20% who are not. Why aren't they graduating? What are some of the reasons they're not graduating? Which groups are maybe represented in the non-graduate group, early leavers? And it's just ironic for me that about 20% of Hamilton's population is racialized, Black, Indigenous, and represents 20% of our communities is diverse. So when we look at this data, it's actually to validate stories I believe that people have been telling us over the years. 2 years ago, or 3, I sat with a group of students who were Black and racialized, and without naming names, shared some of their experiences. So they are frustrated beyond belief to think, we've told you the stories, why do you have to collect this data? But this has been our lived experience. So there are stories out there that we are going to quantify, not just from a small group, but across the entire district. And when I think about when we say we want all students to achieve, if they're not achieving, why are they not achieving? What can we learn about their race, their orientation? And then it starts right in the classroom from the curriculum. So if the curriculum is not connecting with the students' lived experience, then what can we do to change that? If it's because educators in front of them don't understand their lived experience or have bias regarding certain things around students and don't understand, then we need to address this. We're going to have to be courageous around this, and it's going to make people uncomfortable, but we must do it because we have to focus on our students. I'm not comfortable. None of us should be comfortable to look and say that a certain percentage isn't graduating. But I want to bust a myth too. I want to actually look at the data and say how many students from a certain race or a certain group, a specific population, is not graduating, and that data is going to be a powerful story for us to then say why. What are we doing as an institution that's actually enabling a certain group to not be successful over and over and over again? So this data is going to be critical. And when we speak to our students, and I think the group who consulted with our students around the questions, they're saying it's well overdue. So we know this is going to be challenging, but it's about our students succeeding. And if not all students succeed, what's the long-term impact in our community? So this is going to be challenging, and behind this data is a lot of personal stories that we need to unpack, because education is a key. It's one of the key indicators of future success. If they're not being successful, generation after generation is not being successful, then we're failing them. So that's not acceptable, and our kids deserve the best from all of us, and this data is going to tell us a story that we need to unpack and identify with other data sets, just like Safe Schools data around how many students disproportionately might be suspended and expelled, and why, and what can we do differently about it? Are our programs aligning? Do our educators understand their lived experiences? So this data is going to be powerful, and it's going to probably reinforce what people have been telling us for decades, and it's also going to bust some of the beliefs that some people might have that it doesn't exist, and it does, and people in positions of power and privilege, like all of us are, have to be prepared to unpack this for the good of all of us. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you, Manny. Dr. Siobhan, can you also expand maybe what you heard from students regarding like identity and how that impacts them?
I wanted to start by responding to there's a question, I don't think it's published yet, about in my presentation. In my 2 slides, I mentioned that students with disabilities participated in the session. The identities that I shared in my presentation was based on what students shared with me. I will also mention that what students said was that they did notice that there wasn't a specific session for students with disabilities. So we had students with intersectional identity. So we did have students with disabilities present, but it was raised that in the future, we need to have a dedicated session for students with disabilities. So they have that space that they can come out and also share their stories if they want to come to that session. So I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. And Johanna, I'm going to ask you if you could just repeat your question one more time, please.
Yeah, in relation to that question about identity, why is it even important to talk about this? What was it that you heard from students in the consultation session? What does that mean for them to see that their school board is asking these questions?
Yeah, thank you. what I can share with you is that identity means different things for different people, and there are certain identities